All right, welcome back. Here's another digital painting tutorial. This time, we're just going to be looking at tips in general to improve portrait painting. If you're having any struggles, uh, like painting fully realized portraits, hopefully this can help showing you my process, kind of how I do things. So this is going to be a portrait of Joaquin Phoenix's Joker from the movie that came out last year. And I always start by sketching things out. I know there are some painters that start by just kind of smattering colors into a block and then whittling it down. I personally think that takes a lot more skill though. And I like to kind of structure things out with a sketch beforehand. And with this sketch, I actually keep it very rough. I just kind of draw without really editing very much, and then just kind of go through once I'm done with a really super rough sketch, and then I start blocking out all my colors, and then I kind of whittle it down from there. Here I'm just going over with a second layer, making it a little more detailed than the rough sketch, but still keeping it very loose. This sketch isn't really anything impressive in particular, and actually this particular painting takes a long time to get to a spot where I like it. It took me a long time to get to where I wanted it to be, just through constant tweaking, and so that's kind of what you gotta expect with painting is that don't be afraid to rework something or completely paint over something and repaint it. That's just kind of how the process needs to go. Here I start adding in my values, making sure the colors look right. You want to spend a lot of time making sure your colors look correct in the lighting. And actually with this, I play around with the values a lot because this painting doesn't get super detailed. So it gives me a lot of room to just work on shadows and light and dark for this particular painting. The contrast was super high. So I had kind of like Godfather style lighting. It was very top down lighting, so he had these big shadows under his eyes, and I wanted to keep that kind of very dramatic look um, because it helps suit the style of the portrait and the style of the character, obviously. Here I kind of unnecessarily start adding some detail to the hair, like not super intricate detail, but I start adding some smaller strands to the hair. But I ended up completely deleting or erasing the hair and then repainting it later towards the end of the painting. So it's pretty important to try to keep the scope in mind. Like start off very basic, keep everything very basic, and don't go in adding details if you're not ready for them. If the values and everything, the shapes, if they don't look how you want them, then don't go in and add detail because you're most likely just gonna delete it later. Another lesson to be learned with what you're seeing right now is that you can really use any brush to start getting the kind of painting you want, so long as it has adequate like pressure sensitivity and everything. Really, the shape and type of brush doesn't matter too much because, as you can see here, this brush looks really ugly right now because all the lines are super thick and static. They don't have very much variation. So later in the painting, I'm going to end up shrinking down the brush. Now I'm shrinking down the size of the brush as I go in to add more details and flesh things out a bit more. But it's always important to keep in mind that it's never the brush that's your problem. You don't need to go looking for super fancy brush downloads online. This is just like the default Photoshop brush that I use. Here, as you can see, even before I've added the super high contrast for the lighting, I have made sure to keep those dark circles around the eyes for the big shadows, to make sure that I can kind of play around with the shape of his face and make sure the shadows are hitting his face right, because shadows are the most important part of painting, and values, highlights, and darks. How the darks kind of compare to the lights is the most important, making sure the lighting looks right. If the lighting doesn't look right, then the painting is just going to be off and look a lot more amateurish. As you've seen, I've completely erased the hair at this point just to work on the face. It's important to try to simplify your workflow and finish one thing at a time. You can jump around if you want to, so long as you're not losing sight of things that you need to just isolate and get perfected before moving to other parts of the painting. So for this instance, the hair is not necessary, because if I put a lot of detail in the hair and the details are going over the face, but I haven't finished the face yet, I'm going to end up repainting the face anyways. So it's important, or at least it made the most sense to me at this point to just completely get rid of the hair, not worry about it until I'd finish rendering the face. Another tip that's very useful is to make sure to flip your canvas every once in a while. When you're doing portraits like this, usually if they're very symmetrical, you want to make sure, and actually this can work with any painting, not just a portrait. It can work with landscape or like full character paintings, anything. But try to set a little shortcut to flip your canvas so that you can flip it a lot. Actually, I flip it quite a bit, trying to make sure, because if you paint for a long time and then you flip the canvas, it can look completely off and completely strange, because you get so used to how the shapes and everything are formed and how you originally painted it, that they might be a little messed up, they might be a little skewed, but you're just too used to it to notice it. So when you flip the canvas, you can start reworking it as it's flipped. That just helps to make it a lot more structured and make it make more sense. I actually have it hotkeyed on one of the buttons on my drawing tablet so that I can just press one button on the side of my tablet and it flips it. So now it's just whittling away. It's almost like you're sculpting it. I'm just making the details hone in to get more and more tight as the brush gets smaller and smaller. Make sure all the values line up right. Adding smaller details into the face. Starting to become fully realized as a face instead of just a smattering of colors. Also important to give flat parts of your painting a little bit of texture. For example, what I just did over on the makeup on top of his eyes, instead of just letting it be a flat one color, adding just a tiny bit of a gradient, a tiny bit of texture, bumpiness, so it's not completely smooth, just helps sell that it's skin or it's something tangible, something that you can feel. Now around this part, I kind of started to realize that the painting looks a lot more like Mads Mikkelsen than than Joaquin Phoenix for some reason. I mean, also the short hair helps with that. But I end up completely restructuring his cheekbones and painting over all the shadows that I've done. And just kind of goes to show that you shouldn't ever think that what you've done is too perfect to be altered. You know, painting is a interesting process, just getting everything to look right. You're constantly painting over what you've already done and reworking things, shaping it like it's a ball of clay. Here I start to realize exactly how dark the shadows are, so I need to make that match the suit. Since the suit is so bright, it doesn't quite look right until we get the shadow set. It's almost black on his suit because it's only his light really, or his face that's really bathed in light. The suit below him is just completely drenched in shadow, aside from a few highlights that I'll probably be adding in here soon. Light kind of wraps a little around his shoulders because that's natural. His head's not blocking the light. So you always want to think about how light is going to hit in. Make sure everything makes sense. Kind of every once in a while, zoom the picture out and then squint and see if it looks right. See if it looks like the shadows are making sense. And here I'm kind of messing around with a type of rim lighting or a hair light, backlight, whatever you want to call it. A lot of words for it. But basically, kind of like a little outline on the brim of his collar to help outline a little bit more and make it look like there's a big old light coming from the back. It's like a cinematic kind of lighting technique. Helps to define a character's kind of silhouette. So here I add in the black background. So now this is kind of an older painting. I would recommend now to add in your background colors first, so that it's a lot easier from the get-go to kind of realize how the light should affect your character and what kind of light setting that they're in. It didn't end up affecting this painting too much, but it's just a technique now that I use. Now I go in to add the hair, and this is pretty soon I realize that I need to rework the cheekbones, so that's coming up. But now that it's finished, it's a lot easier to go in, or at least somewhat rendered, not finished, but it's easier to go back in and add the hair. But even still, I keep the hair out of his face. Nothing's going in front of his face, so that I can still rework his face if it needs to be done. I actually think for this particular painting, it works out pretty well that it is a painting, because if you see where his makeup kind of wears off and his real skin pokes through, it still looks like it's like his makeup is painted on, just by the effect of it being a painting, which I think worked out pretty well. Now here I'm trying to add a bit of color variation in his hair, because more of the highlights where the light hits it, the hair is going to be a bit warmer, a bit more yellow, but then some of the darker parts of the hair will be a bit bluish, tiny bit, tinge it, make it cooler in the shadows. And then also, since to just add some variation, it's important to make the hair, not every single strand is exactly the same color. You want to make sure it's darker, lighter, a little bit warmer, just to kind of mix it up and make it look like real tangible hair. Here I actually completely redo his hairline. I think because it was looking a lot different than the reference photo, so I just wanted to change that up. It was like a kind of stylistic choice, compositional choice. Now, even still, I'm constantly reworking how his hair is looking, making certain parts deeper in shadow or making little highlights come out, trying to get that perfect balance of how the light would hit the back of his hair. And varying brush width is also important. Little smaller strands of hair sticking out, and then thicker clumps of hair can be used with bigger brush strokes. Helps make it look more like real hair instead of just a kind of wash of colors. So yep, here's what I was talking about when I talk about reworking his entire kind of cheekbones face. A simple kind of change can really affect the way that the image comes across. I mean, now it looks a lot more like Joaquin Phoenix than it does Mads Mikkelsen, because I don't know how it just kind of ended up looking like him because I made the cheekbones too strong. But just goes to show, like, even in late stages of the painting, you can always try to change things around and make sure that they're working as best as they can. Now here I'm adding subtle, as if the light is just kind of barely catching his iris or something is reflecting in it to glow back, but the rest of his eye socket's almost completely black. And now the painting is nearing being completed. I add some shadows to kind of define the edges of your forehead and kind of how your eyebrow comes down to your eyebrows, making sure different planes of the face have different shadows on them. It's very important to kind of think of the face as like a three-dimensional object instead of a flat thing when you're talking about values and shadows and figuring out how to make them look right, how to make them look like they're actually hitting a real object instead of just some flat painting image. Even still now, I'm reworking the hair. One thing that I really like to do with hair is work with like really dark tones first. For example, if you're painting somebody who's blonde, start with like dark brown hair, paint all the hair like that, and then slowly build your way up to blonde, and then make the highlights close to white, but use them pretty selective. So similar with this, I started going back through and making the roots a dark green, almost black. And then the highlights are almost whitish green, like almost a pure white green in certain parts, but keep it very selective when you're doing highlights that bright. But highlights are truly what can make a painting pop if you use them right. Now coming down to the end, it's just constant reworking of his hair. I mean, there are a few times, as you've seen, where I kind of completely restart his hair and resculpt it. Just trying to get whatever looks right. Never get too attached to any one thing that you've made or add too much detail to something that you're not completely on board with. Now, once I finish up the painting, I always like to go through and adjust some of this stuff, some of the light levels, brightness and contrast. Usually try to make it look just a little bit more contrast. You don't want to go too overboard because then it can become too underexposed. And then I'll mess with some slight color levels, figure out exactly what how I want the final product to look. And even again, after going through and doing some of the adjustments, I wipe them clean and go to rework the hair even more, just because something wasn't sitting right, so I just wanted to get just a little bit more out of it. And I actually go over it completely in a light tone or a light opacity with the brush and just make it a lot more green, because I kind of gotten away from the real green color. I was using grays and yellows, so I wanted to put a last little tinge of green over it to finish it off. But then of course you need to still go in and add more details to make sure it doesn't just look like you threw a bucket of green paint over it and smeared it around. It's got to still look like how the painting wanted to be, how the painting needed to be made. So I'm going back, adding the final light adjustments again, brightness and contrast. I really wanted this to look like a very dark, very contrasty painting. And then when you kind of look back, zoom out and squint, you can still see tell exactly what you're looking at. You can tell you're looking at a face with this clown makeup on and these dark eye sockets. And final tiny little details with really thin strokes to make little loose strands of hair. And that's it, is the finished product. So again, what I always say with my paintings is that it's always important to get value right. You gotta nail value, the light and shadow, everything. That's gonna do all the heavy lifting before you add any details, anything fancy. If you have the most well-detailed painting in the world, but the values are all off, somebody's gonna look at it from a distance and wonder what they're looking at and be confused. And when they go up and it's just gonna look strange. It's always important to figure out how the lighting works. Anyways, I hope you learned something from this, and that's it. Peace.